You can call it kindness or compassion or just caring about other people, but just considering that the well-being of other people matters as well as the well-being of yourself, right? In its own right, not just as a means to an end, but in its own right. And the evidence from neuroscience and everywhere is that we're totally capable of that. It's something we have in us, right? And we can cultivate it as well. We can cultivate it by our deliberate choices that we make. Being truthful is much, much more than just not lying. It is doing the best that you practically can to enable another person to understand reality as best you understand it yourself. Begin setting up the kind of decision making that will bring about the quality of life improvements for every kind of being you can think of in the planet.
Good afternoon, Mike. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Great. Well, I know it's your first day back from holiday, so apologies for cramming into your diary, but it's brilliant to get the chance to talk to you. It's been wonderful to anticipate you coming on because in your work, which centers around the climate crisis and environmental challenges we're facing, of course, you cover, all the specifics. But one thing I really enjoy about the way you talk and write about this stuff is you cover things which are highly relevant to our agenda here on the Sentientism podcast. You talk about values, you talk about empathy, you talk about truth critically. And I have a bit of a bugbear because for me, it feels like many of the world's problems people put down to, at least the human caused ones, put down to, bad people with the wrong values and not caring enough. And I think, well, yeah, that's absolutely part of the problem. But actually just getting facts wrong, I think, is as much of a problem. So yeah, it's going to be wonderful to explore that with you. So this is a series of conversations about what I think of as the deepest philosophical questions. Questions like what's real, how do we understand reality, and critically, what matters and who matters, the deep questions of ethics. And I have an obvious bias because I'm trying to develop and popularize this sentientism worldview, which I summarize in one sentence as evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. So when we're thinking about the what's real question, it just says, with humility, use information from reality to try and understand it as well as we can, a broadly scientific, naturalistic approach, if you like. And on the ethics side, it's very open-minded, but it does insist that every sentient being, any being that can feel or experience things at all, should matter seriously in our moral consideration too. But I'm very lucky to talk to people in these conversations who, disagree or agree with that worldview. So it'd be really interesting to know your philosophical journey on those deep questions and where you've got to them now.
Okay, so where should we start?
Well, let's start with me letting you introduce yourself to people who don't already know of your work, and then we can get into the philosophical questions.
Okay, so I'm Mike Berners-Lee. I'm a professor at Lancaster University. Professor of what? I'm not really quite sure the best way to say it. Some people said I should call myself a professor of the future. I don't know. I mean, my work is around mapping climate change impacts and carbon flows. I look at sustainable food system. I look at the role of AI. I look at more widely the role of technology. Those are the things I do academically. I run a business called Small World Consulting that's trying to help organizations to respond to the environmental and wider polycrisis that we are accelerating towards. Occasionally I write books, most recently A Climate of Truth, which comes out later this month, but other books, There's No Planet B, and other books specifically around climate change. But all my work is really trying to create a better world for humans and other beings to live in and to head off some trouble that we're heading for. And I suppose I started off about 20 years ago, and when I first got into this kind of thing, it seemed useful to try and deal with climate change, as we called it then, rather than the climate emergency or the climate crisis or climate breakdown, in isolation. It seemed as though you could break it off as a chunk and focus on that. And it just became increasingly, inescapably clear that all these things are just so joined up that it doesn't work at all to do that. So, all the physical dimensions of the crisis that we're hurtling towards are interconnected. You can't deal with climate in isolation from nature, in isolation from food, in isolation from population. All these things are joined up. But beyond that, you can't deal with any of those in isolation from social questions like how do we do politics, how do we think about economics, how do we run our society, how do we do life, how do we solve problems, and you can't deal with that separate from questions about what matters, who matters, does truth matter, those sorts of questions. So you have to go deeper and deeper, and I only hope I go deep enough. You know, when it comes to questions of philosophy, I'm very pragmatic about it. I only go as far into philosophical questions as I feel it is essential to do in order to deal effectively with what I regard as very practical, very earthy, uh, urgent questions in the here and now.
Yeah, and I really like that approach because as I work on this sort of worldview idea, I do worry that because it is trying to be quite meta, it's trying to be quite foundational, go quite deep. It does sometimes feel like you're moving away from the practical implications and you're sort of getting into sort of deep abstruse theory. But I think at the same time, doing that is really important if you actually want to address the practical problems. And you can go too far into really weird sort of metaethical stuff that has completely lost a connection to the real world. But I think going back to those core root ideas about how we understand the world and who we care about is actually, for me, the optimal point. And I have this sense that, almost every human caused problem is either a failure of facts and evidence, or it is a failure of ethics and morality in some sense. It sort of comes back to those. So if we can have a worldview which addresses both of those stances in the appropriate way, it feels like a robust, broad intervention, because whether people think about their worldviews or not, they underpin every single decision every individual and every institution takes. So yeah, I quite like that way of going fundamental but staying pragmatically connected. Yeah,
I think it's important to work at all these levels at once. I think they feed into each other. I think abstract philosophical thinking can be absolutely pointless on its own. I think, I think about all sort of theoretical constructs, and especially in in the sociology department at the universities I work with and stuff like that. I really I sort of lose patience with them when they lose contact with everyday reality. But equally, it's so flawed to try to deal with something like the climate crisis without deep reflection on it, and as you say, the values that lie behind it. I mean, I think one of the questions that we gloss over a lot is how much of how we basically think and how we basically run society is fit for purpose, and how much do we need to go back to the drawing board on, because here we are in the Anthropocene, and I just use that word very simply to mean the era in which suddenly it's humans that are so powerful on this planet. And yet how we do economics, how we do politics, how we think, how we solve problems, how we approach everything, it all dates back to a time when we could just expand our activities. The world was a robust playground, or we could treat it as if it was a robust playground compared to anything we could do to it. We could get away with anything we liked. If we wanted a bit more space, we could just go and, if we didn't care about native communities from other cultures, we could just go and expand into their land. We could just find more space if we wanted to. And now we're right up against the stops of that, right? There's a hard physical boundary on this little sphere of the earth that we're on. We've explored the lot now, and and we are finding that we're so powerful, we're so technically clever, that we've given ourselves enormous physical power, and we just haven't given ourselves yet the wisdom with which to wield that power in a way that won't damage ourselves. So we're like babies running around with machine guns at the moment, and we've got to catch that up urgently. And the only reason I get into that terrain is because it's impossible to deal with the problem unless we do so.
yeah. Thank you. So with that sort of pragmatic philosophical framing and obviously foregrounding the climate and environmental challenges, let's have a go at some of these deep philosophical questions and see how you've come to answer them. And this is partly about how do you answer those questions now, but it's also a bit more of a sort of journey that you've been through your life about how you answer these questions. So the first one is this what's real question, or more fundamentally, how do we work out what's real? I ultimately think the epistemology is more important really than the specific beliefs we come up with. The toolkit is more important than the conclusions in a way. And for many people, an interesting way into that conversation in terms of their life history is to think about whether they grew up in a religious or a spiritual or a supernaturally minded household, or one that was more naturalistically or scientifically minded, just because that often frames the big questions about, the ultimate nature of reality and how to understand it, and how that way of thinking has changed through their life, if it has. So you can wind the clock back as far as you're comfortable doing to sort of tell the story.
Sure. So I was brought up in a family, my parents were two mathematicians, worked on a very early computer and so on. And they also went to church and took it pretty seriously. But they asked a lot of questions about that stuff. They were not literalist at all. They always wrestled with and asked questions about and took seriously, and it was fundamental to why they were alive, I think, were these sorts of questions. And they felt that the world was fundamentally a beautiful place and that people were fundamentally of value. And I suppose I did grow up with that value pretty deeply instilled, but also asking questions, I think. And that's probably like most people a lot of people when they grow up, at least, went through all these questions about, how do I know that everything that's ever gone through my mind isn't just a figment of my imagination? How do I know? Of course that stuff is totally unanswerable. And there comes a point where there's no point trying. Like, you can practically prove that you'll never be able to answer that stuff. And, is there such a thing as free will? Well, we'll never know. The only thing you can probably prove is that you can never prove it. And so you got questions about how to live your life. And, so I live my life, and I think everyone I've met is the same. I live my life as if there is a concrete reality out there. And, and anyone tells me that can't be proved, I think they disprove their own counter argument by not just falling over and lying in the gutter drinking wine or whatever. It's like you can't take an action without disproving that. So
whatever their protestations, they seem to believe it too, right?
So I take the view that it's useful to live as if there's such a thing as a concrete reality, and it's very, very complex. It's incredibly complex compared to my or anyone else's futile capacities for getting to the bottom of that complexity. Thank goodness, that makes the world interesting. And so I would say the level of complexity is, as far as I can tell, it's infinite compared to me. So what does that mean about trying to understand things? Well, it means that on the one hand, it is purposeful to try to find better ways of understanding the world. But on the other hand, we should all be very cautious about ever making a claim that our way of understanding it is better than another person's way of understanding it. So why doesn't that take me to saying, well, everyone's view of the world is just as good as everyone else's? Well, I come back to I'm very pragmatic about this as well. So I say that, for me, the end point would be, what's the effect that it has? So if somebody says, has a particular religious view, I would be inclined to say, what if I think that the rational argument behind that view seems to be, illogical? But I think I would ask a different question. I would say, well, what effect does it have on the way that that person lives in the world? Does it give them a way of looking at the world that enables them to be a more positive force and to increase the quality of their existence and the existence of the people and other beings around them? And if the answer is yes, then I'd be very slow to criticize that. Yeah, even if the scientist in me could very easily do so. And equally, equally scientific perspectives, very heavily scientifically biased perspectives, I'm very critical of those. Actually, I think that they are as fundamentalist as any form of religious fundamentalism that you can think about. I think science on its own is a very blinkered, reductionist, inadequate way of trying to understand existence.
Yeah. And part of the way I try and address that challenge is really to talk about a naturalistic epistemology and evidence and reason as being broader than science, right? I think science is a particularly formal toolkit that can be really useful in, applying those principles. But I think of evidence and reason as being much broader than that. So I think my own personal experience and your personal life history are forms of evidence in their own right. And we haven't done any science there, but I think there are still information from reality, and we can be skeptical about them and and judge their weight in different ways, but we shouldn't just exclude them because they're not done in a lab or in a randomized control trial.
Yeah, yes, I agree with that, but I would also say to that doesn't mean to say that we should fall into the trap of, oh well, there's my truth and there's your truth, and they if they're different, they can go on, they can coexist with each other. There are also some facts amongst all of this. There are facts and there are opinions and there are worldviews. And if somebody comes along to me and says they think they know how to fly, and I say, no, you don't know how to fly, well, and they say, well, no, my truth is that I can fly. I say, no, that's not your truth. That's your false view of the truth. And if you climb up to the top of a building and jump off, you will find out that your view of the truth was false, right? And it wasn't your truth. It was your false view. And that's important when it comes to things like climate change. We need to keep very firmly in mind there's no such thing as my truth and your truth on whether greenhouse gas emissions are causing the temperatures to rise, right? Truth is not something we might be able to perfectly understand, but we can get meaningful, good enough approximations to the truth. And it's very clear when we do that properly and carefully and using really, really good processes, it is very clear, for example, that humans are causing some climate change, and that climate change is going to have really severe implications for our species and other species as well. It's really clear that we're throwing the dice very, very badly. It's really clear that there's a lot of uncertainty about just how badly we're throwing the dice, and that we might well be throwing them very badly indeed, and it might already be too late. So those sorts of things, we can say, you know, and so when we're talking about truth and people being truthful is much, much more than just not lying. It is doing the best that you practically can to enable another person to understand reality as best you understand it yourself. That's what being truthful is.
And it sounds like part of that is giving up on the idea that we can have perfect knowledge or we can be 100% sure or we have cast iron truth, right? To my mind, a good naturalistic approach is one that is always uncertain, always has credences and levels of confidence and doubt built into the process, because I will sometimes set, a naturalistic epistemology against fideism or unquestioning, unchallenged authority or revelation or a dogmatism, right? But sometimes people who say they have a scientific or a naturalistic worldview can fall into their own dogmas, right? They can become overconfident, and as soon as you think you're 100% sure about anything outside of formal systems, I think you've made a mistake. So I think that doubt, one, gives you a chance to continually self-correct and recalibrate, which gives you a better chance of being true, but it also gives you a better chance of engaging productively with others.
So in all my work, in all my technical work, on the one hand, we're dealing with very, very complex things like, what's going on in the climate system, what's the carbon footprint of a product or a business, or what does the sustainable food and land system look like? What causes what when you make a change to a practice on a farm? I mean, all these things have got hideous complexity and uncertainty in them. But amongst all that, what it's possible to do and really important to do is to find some very simple and important things that you can be just about certain about.
Yeah,
And to
really
hold on
high,
to those.
really
Yeah,
high credences,
because
right?
and the good news is that sometimes those things can tell you a lot about what you should do next. So, for example, you take food system, it's hideously complex, it's hideously uncertain. There are all sorts of problems in understanding it. And it's not just about food, it's about the interaction between food and nature and climate and livelihoods and blah, blah, blah. But one thing comes out really, really clear and simple, which is that we will have a better and more sustainable and healthier food and land system if we can reduce by a long way the amount of meat and dairy in our diets, right? Now that is, as close to a truth as you're ever going to get on a complex subject like that. And it tells you absolute volumes about what any of us can do, right? We can all take action 3 times a day on that piece of information. If you run a food business or a hotel or you're a farmer or anything, that one piece of information tells you a ton about how you should be running your life, doing your job. So I think for me, that's, the art of a lot of what I do is finding simple things like that really matter, are really clear. They're as near as certain as anyone ever gets in anything. And then just hanging on to those important things and treating them consistently as if they really are important.
Yeah, they're giving you some solid ground to work from, and you can acknowledge the uncertainty and confusion elsewhere, but there's some, solid ground you can really push from. Thank you. Well, and I'd quite like to come back to that idea of the agricultural space later on, maybe as a case study, because I think it is one area where epistemologically, I think we're way behind where we've got to on the energy topic for a bunch of reasons. But before we link back to that, let's go through a couple of the other philosophical questions, because I think you were hinting at this quite nicely. In a way, our epistemology, how we know things, has at least a couple of objectives. One is we want to understand the world well, right? Just almost independently, right? It's good to know the truth or something approaching it. But there's also the pragmatic reason you talked about, which is, well, we want to make the world better, so that's why we want to understand it, right? So there's a link to the ethical pragmatics there as well, right? It's not just some ethereal, theoretical reason for wanting to understand the world. We actually want to make it better for the beings in it. So that frames the second of these two questions, which is really about what matters. And there's such a portfolio of things to choose from, rights, justice, fairness, purity, sacredness, obedience to God, joy, care, suffering, flourish. There's so many different things, and many of them interlink. But I'm interested in what was your journey, even again from very young, in a context where there was a sort of broadly Christian framing, but with asking questions. What were your earliest thoughts about what matters and the roots of morality, and how do you think about those things now? What's another weird way of asking that question would be like, why is the climate crisis? Why are these polycrises? Why are they actually a problem? What's the ethical issue we're looking at here?
Okay, so the ethical issue with the climate crisis is it's going to cause humans and other beings to really suffer and die. Right?
So is suffering, suffering and death, is that one part of your answer?
Yeah, I believe there's such a thing as quality of life. That to exist can be a better thing than not to exist. Yeah, and I don't get too deep and heavily into that question because life has ups and downs, and is it possible for the ups to ever be better than the downs in that, all that kind of? You can ask those sorts of questions, but I sort of take the view that they can, and the experience of being alive can be a good thing, and it's one that can be optimized and enriched.
And I think from my perspective, again, sometimes people, I guess, almost feel embarrassed saying something that simple, but I think that's another one of those really solid pieces of ground we can work from. I mean, it is almost like a childlike intuition that suffering almost by definition is bad, and and death is the end of a life, and the potential for flourishing is normally bad.
I don't know what happens at death. I don't think any of us do. I mean, it's just the point at which we don't know what happens next. I mean, I'm not even going to go there. It's pointless. So yeah.
And in a way, if we want to call ourselves moral, that in some way has to be about the concern for others, their experiences, their interests, their suffering. There seems to be a link there.
I think that a really interesting perspective question is how separate are we from other people and from others? And if I was going to draw on I don't subscribe to any one particular spiritual view or another, but I would say that if I was to, I would say I sometimes draw on them a bit, and I would say one thing that the Buddhists are quite interesting on is this idea of interdependence. That nothing exists without everything else, that everything is interconnected. And I find this out practically in all my, in all my work with organizations and on climate and everything, is you can't deal with one thing without seeing it as part of absolutely everything else. But I also think it's true that when people start to see themselves as isolated from, as isolated islands, then it's a route to, it's a fundamentally deluded position, and it leads to them being discontent and unhappy. And when people start to find ways of tuning into a connection with other people, the better they're able to do that, the better, the richer their lives become. So I think there's a kind of, there's an interdependence between us that you can come to understand two ways. One, just by kind of observing what happens to people who ignore it, and people who, who become better at recognizing it. And I'm not trying to set myself up as somebody who's any kind of better than anyone else here. But you can also come to understand it very practically by just trying and solve some of the physical challenges in the world, and try and do it by picking them off one at a time. And you just find the whole thing falls apart on you.
Good luck.
So,
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. So it feels like the sort of ethical foundation you have, is framed around individuals in the sense that it's about, suffering, but there's a recognition that those individuals live in, environments or worlds that are richly interdependent. And so thinking about us as atomized individuals is not a good path to, helping anyone.
It doesn't help. It's unhelpful. The point is, it's unhelpful. Again, just to be pragmatic, it's unhelpful. But it's not, it's not just about that. Life is not just about avoiding suffering. Life is about having a good time as well. It's just pretty trite, life is about having a good experience. And that's what's so frustrating.
Flourishing matters too, as well, right?
Thriving matters, right? Yeah. And that's the whole point, right? So, and what's frustrating about the sustainability agenda is that there's really nothing not to like about it. And yet we get dragged away from it, and we find it hard to take it on. And we're currently, we're accelerating into not just a polycrisis, an absolute meta crisis of probably catastrophic trouble. If I was to predict, I would say we're probably heading for a really very uncomfortable time en masse. But what's so frustrating is the kind of, if you look at it at a superficial level, there's no technical reason why we need to be heading for this trouble. Yeah, it's completely avoidable. Really easily avoidable. Not as if there aren't, some technical things to sit and nut out in order to get around it, but it's fundamentally just not the technology that's stopping us, which takes us into, so what is it then? And that takes you into, well, why is our politics? Why do we have people in the most powerful positions in the world who, when you look at the qualities that they're displaying, they're just clearly not the qualities that we need from the people who are making the most important decisions in the world, right? They're just not. It's just unhelpful. How have we, between the 8 billion of us, how have we allowed those particular people to be the ones who are calling the shots, when it's just, that's just obviously not going to work for anyone. It's not even going to work for those people themselves.
No, I agree. It's deeply frustrating. And I think in the final question, we'll obviously dig into that, but it does seem really strange that in the current context, we have extremely powerful people that not only seem to have completely broken epistemologies and ethics themselves, they seem to be deliberately trying to destroy what's left of public epistemology and ethics too. It's absolutely bizarre. And that has, terrible implications for our chances on the climate polycrisis, as it does for, I think, most of the other human caused problems around the world too. So yeah, it's a strange situation we find ourselves in.
But I mean, there are different ways of kind of trying to frame up the same sort of problem. I mean, in my latest book, I write a little bit about, how can we stay out of the grip of psychopaths? And that's one way of phrasing it up. Ian McGilchrist talks about left brain thinking dominating over right brain thinking, and he talks about how, the trouble with right brain thinking, which is the kind of holistic, systemic thinking, is that it understands what it doesn't understand, so it is naturally hesitant, and thoughtful. And the trouble with left brain thinking, the kind of Elon Musky, Trumpian type kind of neoliberal sort of approach, is that it fundamentally can't see what it doesn't understand. So it's very, very storms into the room with an enormous confidence that's rather, can easily win the day if we're not careful. So, and Ian McGilchrist talks about, others talk about, well, maybe you need to. The trouble is that if one on one, the left brain team wins over the right brain thinking. The right brain thinking only stands a chance when it really gets together en masse. And I talk, if only 1 or 2% of us are psychopaths, then how do we hold them back? By psychopath, I mean somebody who doesn't have capacity for things like empathy, has a low capacity for empathy. Well, we can contain them in society as long as together in society we're really clear about the need for their containment. But if we start getting confused over some basic values that will hold us together, then all that starts to fall apart. So one of those values, and so in my latest book, I write particularly about one of those two values, but there are two really. One is, you can call it kindness or compassion or just caring about other people, but just considering that the well-being of other people matters as well as the well-being of yourself, right, in its own right, not just as a means to an end, but in its own right. And the evidence from neuroscience and everywhere is that we're totally capable of that. It's something we have in us, right? And we can cultivate it as well. We can cultivate it by our deliberate choices that we make.
Yeah, almost everybody feels some compassion for somebody, right?
Yeah, but and now that we've globalized, we need to get better at doing it in a slightly more abstract way. We need to get better at tuning into an emotional response when we hear about something that affects the lives of a few million people on the other side of the world who live in a different culture from us, who we're never going to meet. We need to be able to get better at engaging with that kind of thing rather than just something more visceral like a baby lying on the street in front of us or something, see what I mean? We've got to get better at being a bit more abstract about it. But we've been telling a story about ourselves, the kind of neoliberal story, which is that all humans are greedy. That's how humans that's the only way we've ever got anywhere in life, is by harnessing our greed and so on. And that's a very unhelpful and inaccurate story to tell about humans. And
It's incomplete, isn't it? I mean,
say,
it's incomplete at the very least.
it's incomplete. Yeah. I mean, we're capable of being pretty nasty to each other, but we're capable of being really nice to each other.
Indeed.
We're capable of being really, really nice to each other. Enormous self-sacrifice for other people, enormous thoughtfulness, just a completely different way of living. And we tell unhelpful stories about ourselves, and the people who lack empathy the most tell these stories the hardest, because it sort of normalizes their own behavior and makes them seem like, oh, well, what's wrong with the way I'm carrying on? It's just the nature of humanity. It's not. And we need to reaffirm that value that, everybody matters. And anybody who acts as if only they matter, then we need to take them out of positions of power, right? They need to be contained.
It's that simple.
It's that simple. An election time, right? It needs to be on the agenda. It needs to be a talking point. It needs to be, what is the evidence that this particular person is primarily driven by the best interests of everybody else, right? Let's dig deep into that. What's the evidence that these people are fundamentally kind and thoughtful? Because if they haven't got that quality, then it really doesn't matter how convincing their arguments is or whatever. They just lack a basic quality for the job. And then the second quality,
and before you go on to the second one, if you pick someone whose driving motivation is will to power and might makes right, you might not get a chance to pull the power back, right, if things go wrong.
Well, as the Americans are going to find out over the next 4 years. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And we toss her on the edge here in the UK.
Before we go on to the second value, because and I will let you do that. In a way, this is what we're discussing now, is that the second part of the ethics question of who matters. So I don't know if now is a good time to sort of go into how do you think about that question, and again, how has your view changed over time? Because the caricature is, as a child we start up with some sort of innate compassion. We care about our family and then friends around us, and then as we grow older we might formalize that in some way. Of course, there are some humans who still restrict their moral consideration and compassion for humans who are like them, and we know the problems that causes within humanity itself. So some people don't even get to anthropocentrism, right? They don't even get to caring about all humans. But for many people, there is this sense of, at least in theory, all the 8 billion humans matter, and universal human rights, at least as a stick in the sand, right, is a good aspiration we're still failing to live up to. But people get to that stance. But obviously you can go beyond, right? There's sentiocentrism, where I guess I am, which is caring about all sentient beings. But many, particularly in the environmental movements, will go beyond that to biocentrism, where you intrinsically care about living things, whether or not they're sentient, assuming plants and fungi fit into that category. Or you can go even further to ecocentrism, where there is this more holistic sense of, ecosystems and their components, even if they're not alive, ultimately matter, rights for rivers and rocks and ecosystems and the earth as well, right? So I'm interested in your sort of journey thinking about those sorts of questions, and how do you think about them now?
Well, I think we all find certain parts of the ecosystem easier to identify with than others, right? So, I know in theory that all people should be, in my mind, all people should be treated as if they've got fundamentally equal value as human beings, no matter who they are, and even no matter what they've done. So, me, my own son, Donald Trump, somebody on the other side of the world living in the mud, right? We're all fundamentally equal as human beings in that way, right? Our experience matters an equal amount. And
this might seem a weird question. Why do humans matter?
Well, so on this point, I'm not even gonna go there, right? So, I just mentioned my son, I remember him asking as a kid when he was growing up, he said, you know, so come on, Dad, what's got more, what matters more what's a more important sentient being? An unborn baby the size of your thumbnail, or an earthworm the same size? And he said, I think it's the earthworm because it's got a more complex neurosystem. Well, I don't know the answer to that kind of stuff. And honestly, it's not my terrain. I'm not going to go there. I don't think I've got anything to say on that subject. Right. So, I'm going to make a simple approximation and just say, look, everybody of equal value.
But, and your son asked an interesting question. And in a way, I don't get into the depths of that too. But for me, part of the answer to the question is that all humans, all living humans, matter because of their sentience, rather than just because of a species membership. So, in a way, so regardless of whether we think about perfect equality or grading or something else, that to me, that's the characteristic of humans that makes them morally salient. But for others, it is just it's a species solidarity, right?
I don't have a species
they're my
solidarity.
club, they're my tribe.
No, I don't. This idea that humans have souls but other animals don't. I don't buy into any of that stuff. We talk about ourselves. We've had this narrative that we've been telling ourselves about what a special species we are. Well, we've become the most powerful species, but you could argue the case that we should be the most ashamed species on the planet. We're the worst
track
one.
record is not good.
We're the ones with the most to be ashamed of. Is our sentient experience more or greater or less than that of a dolphin or a whale or an ant? I mean, I'm just not an expert on that stuff, so I don't really go there. But and this business about, do all people matter equally? As it happens, it is something that I was brought up with absolutely as a kind of just take it as read. It was like, I get sometimes, if I'm honest, I get a little bit frustrated sometimes when we get into debates about whether all races should be treated equally, or all sexualities, or because for me, it's all part of a much bigger question. It's just the answer is obviously yes, right?
Yes.
The big question, the big thing is, well, everybody should be encouraged and enabled to live their lives in whatever way is most meaningful to them, in negotiation with everybody else's equal right to do likewise. And if you just follow that principle and apply it, then that is the mechanism by which you nut out all these questions about all these trans debates and all these kinds of things. They just fall out of the wash of that higher principle. So
and I like that approach, because you start with very simple question, which is, some might say, are they human? Okay, then they matter. And I might say, are they sentient? Then they matter, right? And then there's lots to work through, but the foundation is, I think, quite simple. Yeah.
Yeah, we can come back to those questions about, are we sure this person's sentient, or are we sure? Yeah, but we have a principle to work from. So, so I was brought up with that, and for me, it kind of, it resonates, and it absolutely rings true and is really important. But so I suppose I have a personal perspective that instinctively comes at things from that angle. But I also have, and this is what I write from, because I feel like my own personal perspective is just, it's just what I think. Why should anyone listen to that? But I also have a very pragmatic perspective that I fall back on, which is to say that there are 8 billion of us now on this planet together, and it's a very fragile planet. And it is fragile enough that it only takes, a small number of us trying to cause trouble, and we can rock the boat for everybody else. And that is going to be increasingly the case. So if we don't have a society in which we treat everybody properly with equal respect, then we're just not going to succeed in having the global and international cooperation that is absolutely, for practical purposes, essential if we're going to thrive here in the Anthropocene over the next decade, the decade after that, and the decade after that. And I think it is, I think we need to acquire this skill in very short time now.
So there's an ethical rationale to that, but there's also a deeply pragmatic rationale
Yeah,
to that.
and the fact that the two come together, is just like it's triangulation. Right? It's two different angles take you to the same result. Well, okay, feels like that. It feels like the arguments are aligning.
Yeah, thank you. And when we think about going beyond the human, because I'd certainly share that stance too, that at least all of the 8 billion humans matter and should matter seriously. When we go beyond the human, in a way, it changes our frame on the polycrisis in quite a deep way, because we go from recognizing, there are potentially 8 billion sentient beings that could be affected and are being affected already day to day by these polycrises. And if we expand out to thinking about all sentient beings, I mean, we can't even count them. There might be quintillions, sextillions of them. And those are non-human animals, largely living in our labs and in our farms. And those numbers themselves are mind-blowing. If you include fisheries, that's probably a couple of trillion. But then when you go out into the wild, we literally are talking quintillions, sextillions, and it depends where the boundary of sentience is. But I mean, you've almost gone from a situation thinking, how many victims of these polycrises are there? There's not just 8 billion, there's potentially, sextillions of them. How have you thought about, I guess, the animal question and moral consideration that goes beyond the human?
Yeah, I suppose, there are some questions that I don't get too far into. I think, because you can get into a question of, well, you could say, well, wouldn't it be a good idea just to maximize the number of sentient beings in the world, and especially, the amount of sentience in the world? Well, just maybe the way to do that would be to increase the number of humans, or maybe it's increase the number of farm animals. I don't go down. I don't subscribe to that logic, but I can't, I can tell you a hand on heart reason why not to. But I would say that there are some people who, I talked about empathy and the importance of the capacity to empathize. And I know for sure that there are some people who empathize with other species more strongly than I do. So, when we found out our dog was terminally ill, there was some people in my family were crying their eyes out, and I was just vaguely a bit sad about it for a day or two. We're different in this way, right? Some people appreciate the natural, the rest of the natural world in a way that, I know there are people who tune into that more strongly than I do, and I think it's like a skill to acquire as best you can. So, I fall back on keeping it simple in my work. I fall back on the pragmatic reasons.
Yeah. So it feels like there would be a consideration for non-human animals of some sort. You don't necessarily empathically feel that very directly, but the pragmatic focus is on the human. Is that?
Well, no, I do a bit. I just don't go deep into that terrain in my work. So, I think if you look at what goes on a chicken farm, a factory chicken farm, if you think about it and you contemplate it, then your emotional reaction to eating that chicken changes. There's no doubt about it, right? And that's a mixture of reasons. It's partly because you contemplate the life of the animal, and it's partly because you contemplate what the health impacts for you of eating that animal might be. And it's partly, just the ugliness of the whole situation, and I can't separate out what's going on where, but somehow, if you go and meditate on that for a little while, the amount to which you'd want to eat that £2.50 chicken is going to change.
Yeah. And then you have the climate, issues, the multivariate climate issues off the back of that as well, which
And
we'll
yeah,
be
and
good
linked
to
to
dig
all
into
that.
too. And because that's one of the interesting areas where this ethical challenge the rubber hits the road with most humans. And I think, again, it's analogous with some of the things you were talking about before, where the theory is that most humans do care about non-human animals, at least some of them, but we've been so socially normalized into thinking that animal agriculture is ethical, even desirable, that it's very hard for even individuals who have that empathy and that philosophical stance to put that into practice. And is that something that you've worked through yourself? I mean, I know my understanding is you've made, dietary changes and various other changes to your life to try and improve your carbon footprint. Is that something you've tried to work through when it comes to you're thinking about the ethics of animal agriculture itself and your own life? Because I'm interested in that journey. Because for some people, that's really easy. They think about what it's like to be the chicken and then they just go vegan overnight. And for other people, it is a much more challenging psychological and sociological, thing they're still working through. But
it's a dimension of the problem for me. And for me, whereas some people will get an emotional response that is so strong that that's enough to totally drive everything. I'd say for me, it's more of I will understand it logically and
yeah,
I'll
it's like an
say, this isn't
intellectual.
good. I've understood that this isn't good. Therefore, I'm going to care about it. You know what I mean? It's a bit
Yeah.
more of a conscious thing.
Yeah, thank you. And I find that fascinating in the conversations I've had. It really does seem like an interesting mix. For some, it is very much an intuitive, emotional response. Sometimes a disgust response as well. And for others, it's a much more technical, intellectual thing where they don't necessarily feel the feelings strongly, but they've just literally thought it through logically and philosophically and taken a journey. So that's interesting. Thank you. So I'm interested about going even beyond that. So a couple of the first times the word sentientism was used in the 1970s was actually by people criticizing it because they were saying, look, we should go beyond, we should go into biocentrism and ecocentrism. And they were saying, look, this focus on the sentient in a way is like another form of discrimination because you're discriminating against plants and rivers and fungi and trees and ecosystems. So it was quite interesting that it was, people from outside challenging it. So, and that's I think a central theme in the modern environmental movement is consideration for the wider biosphere and ecosphere. But I think there's at least a couple of ways you can work that through. So, I'm quite strict about my sentientism, if you like. I think ultimately all value in the end comes back to sentient beings and their interests. But that still leaves me with a really rich environmental concern because of the interdependence you talked about before. So I care about rocks, rivers, trees, and ecosystems and the earth because of the sentient beings that richly interdepend and depend on those things. Whereas others, a technical biocentrist will say, no, you're actually doing a moral wrong cutting a blade of grass or killing a plant because that plant is not sentient, but they have intrinsic moral consideration. In the same way, some people will say, we should grant rights to rivers, not just to help the fish and help the animals and help the humans, but because the river is itself a sort of moral being that matters. How do you think about that stuff?
Well, I think, there's a lot of stuff that I don't know. And there's a lot of stuff that I think is pretty difficult to know. And, whether the experience of a river for its own sake is something, I'm not going to go there because I've got no qualifications to go there. I'm not sure there's anybody who has. So I'll go back to being pragmatic and say, actually, we're back to this interdependence thing. You can't have one without the other. You can't have the healthy sentient beings without the healthy river. And so what's the point in distinguishing? And then back to the Buddhist, the Zen perspective, there's only one existence really. Existence is existence, and try and separate off any one bit of it, and you're making a deluded mistake in how you interpret the world. And I think that, That's
That
so
makes
back
sense.
to back to keeping it simple in order to take things back to the practical.
Yeah, I like it. Thank you. And I guess part of my frustration with part of the modern environmental movement is when the biocentrism or ecocentrism, when you scratch the surface of it a little bit, it just seems to be more anthropocentrism, because I think a lot of the modern environmental movement, when you ask, why, what are you, why are these things important to you? It can be boiled down to, well, us humans need these sorts of ecosystem services. We need a comfortable temperature range to live in, and I want nature to be aesthetically pretty. And to my mind, that's not really ecocentrism. That's back to, we need this environment because us humans want it.
No, we have
And
to treat animals as we have to treat other beings as if they matter
yes,
in the same way, not just because they can serve us, but because they matter in their own right.
and that's the test for me, because I think if you claim to have an ecocentric moral scope, but you exclude all of the non-human biological sentient animals in the wild and in farms and in labs, that's not ecocentric either, right? It really is just a very human-centered approach. So, I'd agree. There's the interdependence reason and the instrumental reason, but those non-human sentient beings matter intrinsically because they matter to themselves, so they should matter to us. But I think so. That's been really fascinating. Thank you. I think we've answered all of the deep philosophical questions now, and I like the sort of approach of pragmatism, so we don't get lost in the weeds, even though I'm trying to drag you down into them sometimes. So we've answered sort of what's real, what matters, and who matters. The final question, just as crazily broad, is how do we make a better world? And you've framed that to some degree already, and it's a theme that comes up in a lot of these conversations, because almost for so many of the problems we're facing, actually the basic science and the technology and even the philosophy is quite straightforward. The dark heart of the problem, as you've said already, is in human psychology and sociology and social norms and political will and institutional inertia and all of that sort of stuff. So we're in this weird position where we've now worked out who matters, at least broadly speaking. We've worked out how we want to try and understand the world pragmatically so that we can then make the world better. And a lot of the solutions technically are, already in our grasp, but these things are extremely hard to respond to. So what's your big picture view of, I guess, do you have a sort of utopian vision that I know you sometimes discuss in your writing about where we could get to, and your big picture thoughts about how we could get there?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm always in my work. I'm always looking for what are the points of leverage? What are the things that we could do something about that will make the most practical difference? And we've talked about sentient beings mattering and people mattering and all that stuff, and everybody having equal value and so on. My book, I've just written this book, A Climate of Truth, and it's all about how truth matters. And that's for two reasons. Maybe it's because maybe it matters in its own right. Okay, it's just it's just a valuable thing, right? It's just when we look at what does a quality of life look like, it's about authenticity and truth. Are probably important in order to having that quality of life. But if we come back to the practicalities of the polycrisis, how are 8 billion people going to thrive on this fragile planet when we're so powerful? Deal with climate and feed everyone and manage our population and look after nature and fend off disease threats and make sure that all 8 billion people have got a life that's worth living and so on, then these problems are really difficult to solve. And we have to have the clearest view of reality as best we can understand it that we can possibly get. Otherwise, we're going to mess it up. We need the highest quality of decision making. Right?
However good our intentions are. Yeah.
However good our intentions are, right? Once we've got good intentions, we need the highest quality of decision making that we can get. And we don't have the room anymore to throw a spanner in the works with deliberate misinformation. A piece of deliberate misinformation is just a total spanner in the decision-making process that we got to get rid of. And I'm not just talking about lies. I'm talking about anybody who does anything at all that confuses, that tries to encourage another person into a view of reality that's other than how they absolutely see it. right? So anything at all that's not absolutely straightforward, we need to scream against that, right? Because it's so destructive. So I'm talking about anybody who, not just lies, but saying things that imply something. So a famous example is, about money for the NHS on the side of a bus. I'm not trying to be party political about this, but it's an illustration of, that kind of thing. It wasn't quite a lie, but it was absolutely misinforming. But there's much more to it than that. If somebody says that the reason they want something is different from the reason, they're proposing something is different from the real reason why they think it's a good idea, that's misinformation, right? That's show-stopping misinformation. If the reason why you want something is a legitimate reason, then go on, tell us the real reason, right? Don't try and sell something in for the wrong reason, just to kind of to try and be practical about it. That's taking us backwards. Selection of evidence that's, picking the evidence that's going to give you the answer you're looking for, that kind of thing. There's so many ways in which, in fact, in the book, I've got a whole taxonomy of deceit that I write to try and flesh out all the myriad of ways in which a politician or a media outlet or a business could try to mislead the public into believing some version of reality that's not quite right.
And I find that approach almost more insidious, right? Because I frame the sentientism idea as committed to using evidence and reason in a naturalistic approach, as opposed to, a dogmatic approach or an arbitrary approach where you just or a fabricated approach where you just make stuff up. But in a way, the most insidious stuff is people who are pretending to use evidence and reason, but they're actually not. So, pseudoscience is a classic example of that, but cherry picking evidence, choosing the wrong people to trust, doing your own research and ending up following some guy on YouTube who's just grifting you supplements, right? There's so many ways of doing evidence and reason badly, right? It should be obvious that we want to do it well, but that's where the real challenge, I think, lies.
And it's so easy. It's so easy to misinform now, right? Because the issues are so complex, and all of us are lay people on almost all of those issues. And so we have to work out what we trust, right? And that is a difficult challenge, because it's so easy to fabricate plausible nonsense, very plausible nonsense. And it's increasingly easier to do that. And AI is not helping us. It's going to make it easier and easier and easier to fabricate nonsense. So when all this is going on, how are we going to create the title of the book, A Climate of Truth? How are we going to create a climate in which it is the truth as best we can grasp it that comes to the top? And the way to do that is we need to care about it much, much more. We need to have a very careful look at what truth looks like, but what it looks like when somebody is being properly straightforward and honest with us, and all the different ways in which it might be different from that. And we need to be able to notice that difference. That's the first thing. So that's about teaching our kids critical thinking. It's about teaching ourselves critical thinking. It's about taking the time to ask ourselves careful, reflective questions. What is the evidence I've got that this person who's trying to be an MP or trying to be a business leader or writing an article in a paper or doing something on social media or whatever, what evidence am I using to let me know that I can trust what they're saying? And is that evidence good enough? What is my emotional reaction? What is it am I being driven by some emotive thing that's pushing me to want to believe it, even when it's not right? We need to get self-reflective and we need to get critical in our thinking on this stuff so that we're properly alert to it.
And it's frustrating because I'm lucky enough to run workshops in schools around worldviews and epistemology and these sorts of topics. But when you look through the standard curriculum in the UK, and I think it's broadly true around the world, in some places around the world, you're explicitly told outright falsehoods, right, and expected to believe them. But in many places around the world, you look in the curriculum and say, well, I'd expect epistemology to be, and critical thinking to be here and here and here. And often it just isn't. So in science classes, you list lots of facts, but you don't really go into evidence and credences and, fallacies and critical thinking. In religious education, you learn lists of beliefs, but you don't really learn about, well, how do people ground those beliefs and what are the different ways of thinking?
We need to get much sharper. And it's something that all of us, it's not just something that we help others to get better at. All of us, however good each one of us is at the moment, all of us need to try to get better at it.
It's so easy to find holes in other people's epistemology and not
Yeah,
ours,
yeah.
right? The real challenge is, can you challenge beliefs you really want to hold on to yourself?
Exactly. Yeah. So a bit of reflection, a bit of noticing our own emotional reactions to different things. What do we find difficult? What do we find difficult to accept? What do we find easy to accept? What are we getting angry about? And what might we be running away from? Those sorts of questions. We all need to get as reflective as we can on that. So there's definitely, there's an inner dimension to this for sure. And there's the dimension of helping other people to get better at it as well. And to that end, in the book, I write out some simple guidelines on this is how you might tell whether this politician is somebody you can trust, whether this media outlet is something you can trust, whether this business is something you can trust. And then the final thing is, what do you do? What does it mean if you find out that you've been deliberately misled? And I think this is where we can really change the dial, right? So if we find out that a politician, for example, has deliberately misled us on a matter of policy, right? Then that tells us an enormous amount. It's like, why would they do that if they had our best interests at heart? Well, you could sort of maybe argue that occasionally they believe in a white lie or something, misguidedly believe in the concept of a white lie, but which I also talk about in the book it's basically a bogus concept. If they've done it deliberately, it tells us that they want something that's against our interests, right? It tells us we can't trust them. And if they've done it on one thing, it tells us we can't trust them on anything at all, right? Nothing. So if they've said something about climate that's not quite how they see it, or they've said that, I list out in the book, I don't want to, it's not about naming and shaming particularly, but by way of example, I do list out quite a few current politicians and, as being totally unfit for office, because if you find just this one example, it actually tells you that unless they have some quite rare transformative experience, they don't value truth highly, and you can't trust them on anything at all ever. And that tells you they are unfit for office.
Yeah. So it's not the statement they've made, it's that the statement they've made is an indication of their own values, their own motives, and their own often broken epistemology.
And
it tells you, in one hit.
In one hit, it tells you all you need to know about whether you should be putting a cross in the ballot box, right? And, you might have to be choosing between the lesser of evils at the ballot box, but it does, right? But which you should do, by the way. If you think everybody's unfit, it's very important that you choose the least unfit.
Still have some influence, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if everyone does that, you've raised the bar and all this. But it tells you another thing as well, and this is the killer, right? It also tells you that any of their colleagues who have been staying quiet in the knowledge that they have been careless with the truth is also unfit for their role, right? So when you expand that out, you get a situation in which, I don't want to get too party political about this, but just by way of example, a year ago we had a party in which every single MP had shown themselves to be unfit because all of them were staying quiet while members of their own party were telling routine untruths all the time, right? And we've obviously got that going on in other countries in the world at the moment. And we don't have to have it like that. Like in this country, just in the UK, we've been careless over truth. And around other countries around the world, we've been careless about it. We've treated it as if it doesn't matter all that much. And maybe it's okay if somebody just, they're a good guy. Okay, they lie sometimes, but never mind. Actually, it really, really matters. We need to treat it as abuse, right? If somebody tells us something that they know isn't true in order to manipulate us in some way into voting for them or going along with some policy or something like that, it tells us they absolutely have no role in our politics and we need better. And if we can establish that value, we can create a situation where not only do we create an environment in which the people who have got the qualities that we need, who are honest and compassionate are better able to come to the top of our politics. But we also create an environment in which we will bring out the best in everybody who's there. Right? So even the worst players who are there won't be operating at their worst because they'll know they can't get away with it. And so we'll raise the bar, and we will create the environment in which the quality of decision making that we need to have can for the first time become possible. And that will enable us for the first time to begin dealing with the climate crisis, begin getting a sustainable food system, begin dealing with plastic pollution, begin dealing with, I haven't even talked about inequality, which of course is huge and central in this whole thing. Begin setting up the kind of decision making that will bring about the quality of life improvements for every kind of being you can think of on the planet.
And I mean, I love that approach because I have this bugbear about people not focusing enough on epistemology and facts and reality and truth. And so I really like the approach of, in the same way as we should with a politician who clearly demonstrates broken values or exclusionary ethics, right? Generally, we will challenge them and not vote for them again, right? I agree. We should take a similar approach for people who have broken or warped epistemologies that are dangerous. I think we should be entirely consistent. But at the same time, some people will respond to that by saying, well, it sounds like you're trying to constrain free speech, or that's often a disingenuous challenge, right? There are many people who claim they are free speech purists who clearly only want free speech for certain people. But there is a more maybe good faith challenge, which is, a worry about, are we constraining the marketplace of ideas and fresh new thinking and different ideas? Is there a worry that you're going to try and impose a sort of, a strict, here's the facts, and anyone who goes off?
No, it's a good question, right? So, all right. So let's say I say climate change is a thing and it's made by humans, and somebody else says, no, I don't think it is. Right? Well, that's okay. That's free speech. They can say that.
It might have been the Jewish space lasers, for example. So, who knows?
Well, okay. Well, so
and shockingly, there are American politicians who've said that. But let's move on from that exact example.
They can say that, right? But then they need to be accountable for that, right? And they need to be able to put up their case. And if in the defense of their case, they say things that are bogus, right? Then, quite often you can't necessarily prove that someone's been deliberately deceitful, but you can show that either they don't have good critical faculties or they're deceitful. Like if somebody says now that they're not sure whether climate change is really a thing or not, right? Then you can't prove that they're lying, that they're saying something they don't believe, right? Yeah. But you can prove that either they're lying to you or their critical faculties are just not fit for purpose. They don't know the difference. When they read a piece of information, they don't have the ability to see whether it's fact or fiction, right? And either way, they're unfit for office, right? So
whether it's disingenuous or they're just not capable.
Yeah. So free speech, sure. But there's a responsibility that comes with that free speech. There are consequences of that free speech. So if you go and say something that is unhelpful and wrong, then, and this is what we need to insist on as a society, then you have the right to do it. Let's say, you have the right to deceive us, but if you do it, we have the right to make it clear that you are unfit ever to be trusted with any position in life. And it's not about trying to get our own back or trying to make them suffer. We should still treat them with respect. I think this is a really important principle. Everybody needs treating with respect. Elon Musk, Donald Trump, everybody. However unhelpful we think they are in the world, they're still, as you put it, they're a sentient being. So it's not about trying to make them suffer. It's about containing them for the sake of everybody else. So they are in the wrong job. I don't mind if Elon Musk becomes a boxer or I don't know what. There's probably a ton of ways he can spend his days, right? But not running the world.
Yeah. No, I love it. Thank you. So maybe one of the interesting things in this, how to make a better world, in a way, that's the theme of a lot of your writing in your current book, is focused on how do we address these crises. And you give some really rich diagnoses and prescriptions, obviously on the energy side of the climate crisis. And there's a degree to which my sense is that a lot of people have at least grasped the basics on the energy front, right? They know that we need to end fossil fuels. They know we need renewables. They know we maybe need hydrogen and battery storage. They know, they've at least got the basics, in terms of roughly, they know it's a big problem. We've got to do stuff. And there's loads of political issues and sociological issues about how do we do that. But as you've said in your books, the technical solutions are basically pretty much there already on the energy side of the problem.
Well, some of them are, and some of them are hidden. I mean, it's very funny how simple some of the things that are not well understood. So, I wrote a book, The Burning Question, about over 10 years ago now, and with Duncan Clark. And one of the central things we were saying in that book is we need to leave the fossil fuel in the ground, right? And unbelievably, only 12 years ago, that was not in the common narrative, right? Halfway through writing the book, Bill McGibbon wrote an article for Rolling Stone called something like Do the Math, and that went viral. And it was saying, look, we need to leave the fossil fuel in the ground. And, and that was what we were writing about. But, that was the beginnings of that argument really coming out in that clarity. And it was just like, duh. How could it be so long? But there were things that are equally simple as that are still not properly understood, right? So one of them is we need to use less energy, right? The world needs to reduce its energy consumption, and we just don't talk about it anything like enough. Loads of people fudge over it. It's uncomfortable. The energy companies don't like it. Not even the renewable energy companies like it, right? All the renewable energy in the world won't help us because the climate doesn't care how much renewable energy we've got. It cares how little fossil fuel we burn. And at the moment, we're just having more of both, right? And so
it's like adding on, but it's not yet displacing. Yeah.
And here's another really simple thing. I talk about these, what's as close to a fact as you can get that's really, really important and simple. And if we all just acknowledged this and worked with it, it would get us a long way. Another one is this concept of rebound effects, right? When you make an efficiency improvement in the global economy of almost anything you can think of, the net impact is not by default for the environmental impacts to go down. It is for them to go up. Because when we become more efficient at doing things, the amount more that we do of those things goes up even faster than the efficiency improvement, right? This is it's so critical for policymakers to understand that, right? We will not get ourselves out of this by efficiency improvements alone. In fact, on their own, efficiency improvements are just part of the dynamic by which we accelerate into the problem, right? And that is so critical for policymakers. And it's not a really difficult concept. It's slightly counterintuitive for some people some of the time at first. But, it's not too hard for us to grasp. And we need to get out, so when you say, the sort of the basic facts around the technological solution are out there, a lot of people get them. I think some of them, really critical ones, are still fudged over, right? And they need flushing out.
Yeah, and that's an important pushback because I don't want to pretend that the job is done, right? And I think it links to the sort of misinformation, disinformation, and truth story around the energy stuff as well, because we have gone from, ExxonMobil and other companies, outright denial, hiding stuff, warping science, denial, to a sort of, they're still doing some of that now, right? But there's also a sort of, okay, we see where this is going, but let's still try and steer the agenda in directions that sort us,
and
right?
It's just as effective, right? The fossil fuel companies are just as effective as they've ever been, right? They are. We've had 29 climate COPs now over a period of 30 years. And during that time, we have been accelerating the rate at which we take fossil fuel out of the ground and burn it. Right. So they are more
all at the same time as it feels like we're doing stuff.
And, the best result you can get from a climate COP is to create a storyline that looks as though you've got somewhere, maybe not quite made as much progress as we'd hoped for, but at least we made some progress. If you can create that sense when actually you've got nowhere at all, right, and done nothing whatever to reduce the rate at which fossil fuel comes out of the ground, then that's the best win a fossil fuel company can have if they want to pervert the agenda.
Yeah. And their level of expertise is absolutely mind blowing. I mean, the lobbyists, the PR companies, and the marketers, they deserve all their big bonuses because what they've managed to do is absolutely mind blowingly successful
So
in those terms.
we who care about truth, right, have got to really care about it, right? Because, they get away with it. If they're caught out, it doesn't matter. It's just, oh, well, that one didn't work. Never mind. Let's find a new form of deceit. We need to create an environment where if they're caught out, that matters so much. It's a showstopper. It's like, oh my God, we won't try that on again. And every other business looks at them and goes, oh, we're not going near that. And every other industry, right? And I'm talking about the meat industry, the tech industry. I'm talking about, every industry you look at the moment has got, there are a lot of industries at the moment that are creating false narratives that are really, really harmful. And the people who push those narratives need to be out of their careers.
Yeah, agree. Now, there's one area where it's a personal bugbear of mine that I think is even way behind the energy stuff, which is animal agriculture. Now, I have a dual motivation, as you might have guessed, because I think the entire industry is an ethical abomination, even if it doesn't have any climate impacts, because of my sentiocentrism. Right? So there's a risk of some motivated reasoning right there, but there's an ethical reason why I would love to see that entire industry ultimately come to a just transitioned end. But it feels like even just in the climate and the environmental space, we're a long way behind even where we are on fossil fuels, because the misinformation and disinformation is rich and robust. Culturally, it's misinformation that most people are desperate to be conned by, right? Because we want to think that what we do is normal and natural and necessary and it's okay and let's carry on. It's culturally, richly embedded in food and products through the way we like to live. So we're primed to suck up the misinformation and disinformation from the industry when they tell us that their industries are humane and sustainable. And it's again, it's one of these areas where I think it's less an ethical failing, because most human beings do, at least to some degree, care about non-human animals ethically. But it's an epistemological failure, because when you look at statements like, their industry is humane and sustainable, that's a claim about facts and the definitions of those words, which is completely unsubstantiated. So I'm really interested in, because you've done a lot of work on the animal agriculture space, of how you think the truth agenda and the misinformation and the disinformation agenda is playing through, because that feels like an area of the climate crisis that we're way behind, even behind fossil fuels. And there's a taboo even amongst many environmentalists about even talking about it. I need to stop ranting soon, right? But the number of podcasts or lectures or papers I've heard where the environmentalist is asked, what can we do? What changes do we need to do? And they don't even want to talk about food. They don't even want to talk about agricultural systems. I'm like, it just drives me nuts, right?
So in some ways, the food agenda is a harder one to deal with than climate, and in some ways, it's easier than the fossil fuel agenda. So why is it harder? It's harder because it's more complex. I think at least greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel is about a simple molecule, and you can count them up there, and the number of them there are, the more warming there is, and so on. But the food agenda has got more scientific uncertainty in what goes on in the fields, and we've got this multiple agenda of trying to feed everyone and look after nature and deal with climate, and on top of that, you've got animal welfare and health, and it's more complex. But on the other hand, there are some blindingly simple realities that can come out of it, really clear cut. A bit like the need to leave the fossil fuel in the ground, we have the need to reduce the amount of meat and dairy in the food system, and the need for some agroecological practices, and a few things and the need to reduce waste, and a few things I could point to that would just give us, if we could just follow these principles, it would get us nearly all the way, right? So. And you're right that the meat industry is rolling its sleeves up with just as much cynicism as the fossil fuel industry. And it's pretty dark to not all of the meat industry, but the big players in the mainstream meat industry, for sure.
Yeah. And it's often the same lawyers and PR
Sure.
firms and marketers and lobbyists. Yeah.
It's the playbook of the tobacco industry, only it's more sophisticated than that now. It's very, very sophisticated.
Big tobacco, big oil, big meat. Yeah.
Yeah, they're all in it. But here's why I think it's easier. I think climate change impacts don't come down to don't come back to hit the individual in the same way. In other words, your personal carbon footprint doesn't come back to hit you, right? But the way that you eat meat and dairy and what's in the stuff that goes in your mouth, that comes back to hit you, right? And what you're chewing when you're chewing your lump of chicken from the supermarket, what you think about the life of that chicken, if you ever do think about it, like that's quite personal and tangible in a way that those invisible gases coming out of your exhaust pipe kind of aren't.
Yeah, the responsibility feels more direct in
It feels
some
more
way.
direct.
The victim is
And
there.
if what you're eating has been packed full of antibiotics and it no longer contains any omega-3 because the way the chicken's been farmed has been so optimized to maximize the number of kilograms of meat production per day of life of the chicken, that the only way to do it is to massively increase the fat content and decrease the nutrient content and so on. That comes back to bite, right? And if this bacon is going to give you cancer because of the way that this pig was reared, that feels pretty grim. And if the reality is that it's far more, you can produce good quality, healthy nutrition far more efficiently and cheaply through a plant-based diet or a primarily plant-based diet than you can through having such a lot of meat and dairy in it. That reality, if the reality is that you can be healthier and live longer, right? And the imagery that you imagine when you imagine that the life of what you're putting into your mouth, the history of what you're putting into your mouth, when all those things come together to just make it feel better to put something different into your mouth.
Should be a win-win-win, shouldn't it? Yeah.
It's a win-win-win. And, the fundamental efficiency of a more plant-based food system is so great that somebody somewhere gets to be better off. There's a whole economic question about whether it's the farmers or the food processors or the supermarkets or the governments or the end consumer or how that benefit is spread between them all. But it's a fundamental improvement.
And it's the scale of it is mind blowing as well. If coming back to the idea about facts, if there were
really
two
big
facts
deal.
I wish environmentalists understood deeply, it would be feed conversion ratios and trophic chain inefficiency, right? You're worried about throwing out wonky vegetables from Sainsbury's, but the feed conversion ratio, waste of input to an animal compared to the output, can be 90 to 95%. It's mind blowing. And the other one is land use. Right? Again, the incontrovertible facts.
We looked at a sheep farm in the Lake District near us, and we looked at the human digestible. And so everyone thinks about these sheep roaming on the hills in the Lake District. Oh, well, they're just up there on the wild land, and they're eating plants that nobody could do anything with, and they're just and so the meat that we get from them, it's just an addition to the human diet, isn't it? Well, okay, but we looked at the human digestible nutrition in the sheep feed that goes to supplement all that feed, all that grass and heather that they eat, and found that there was more going into the sheep feed than there was in the sheep when they go to slaughter, right? So in other words, even in that situation, even when you think of them as just living off the hills, even in that situation, they're just taking nutrition out of the food system for us. And then we looked at the money they were spending on the sheep feed and the antibiotics, and that was more than the farmers were getting for the sheep, right? So this whole system, and
Makes
then
no
we looked
sense.
at finally we looked at the effect they're having on nature, which is they're trimming every plant down to two millimeters off the ground or whatever.
Not to mention the historic deforestation, the reforestation opportunity, the emissions from ruminants.
Yeah, all of that. So the whole thing's a complete disaster, right? And it's not what the public generally understands when they think of, especially when they think of Lake District sheep or something like that. So there are the current food system is propped up on the consumer not understanding it. And 100 years ago, most people stood to live longer and healthier lives if they had a bit more meat, because our plant-based diets were so restricted. If you're only eating potatoes, carrots, and meat when you can get it, then you're better off having a good chunk of meat in your diet. But if you've got access to everything in a modern supermarket, then those old traditional arguments that gave meat the status it's got at the moment just are gone. They are historical, fuddy-duddy, out-of-date stuff that doesn't apply anymore.
That's fascinating. Thank you. I do need to let you go. So before you run, is there anything else you wanted to add in? But also, how can people follow you? Buy your books, of course, including, I'm not sure exactly when we'll publish this episode, but I think I'll be right in saying your book is out now. I'm going to try and synchronize.
So A Climate of Truth is a very simple guide to, what's going on in the world and, what's going on at a physical level, and how the solutions are there from a technical point of view, but what that takes us to in terms of what it would take to solve those technically solvable problems. And that takes us into the point of highest leverage, is creating a culture of truth. And most importantly, for every reader, this is your point of agency. If you're feeling like this is a big global challenge and you've been feeling like there's nothing I can do that's meaningful, you know what? There really is. Just let's stand up for this concept of truth that we've been so careless about. And, all of us can do absolutely plenty to very purposefully raise the bar, and it will make a difference. And it's how we will begin solving these challenges that have been completely eluding us for the last 3 decades. So anyway, that book's coming out, end of March. And if you want to follow me, what I would say is, I'm not huge on social media, but I'm on Blue Sky and I'm not on X. So I would say, in terms of social media, the more general message is, please do avoid any social media in which you do not trust the owner, or you don't trust their algorithms, or there's some evidence that they've ever manipulated the public to try and do something that may be against their interests, or enabled them to have views that are other than the best view of the truth. And if you can't trust your media, whether it's social or traditional, please switch right now.
That's a great closing message. Thank you. And again, that personal agency is, yes, in our own lives, but it's also affecting those institutions and steering those institutions too. It's just as important. Well, thank you so much for focusing so hard on truth and value, things I love to talk about here. It's been an honor to have you as a guest on Sentientism. So thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Jamie. It's good to talk. Okay.
Take care. Please stay in touch too.